Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horne, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horne, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horne. I am absolutely delighted to have in our virtual studio today, Gary R. Simonds. And I'm going to spell that last, the surname, Simonds. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want you to miss anything about Gary Simonds, who is our guest today. As many in our audience know, I usually describe my work in 3 words: coach, mentor, teacher, and my pursuits fulfill all of those 3 words. Gary is an individual who it can be described in 4 words. Neurosurgeon, writer, educator, and speaker. Now, before I let Gary fulfill that last role of speaker and letting him talk with everyone in our audience, I want to give you a little more background on Gary. So he was the founding chief of Neurosurgery and the Neurosurgery residency program, director at the Carillon Clinic in the Virginia Tech Carillon School of Medicine until retiring from clinical neurosurgery in 2019. He remains a professor at Virginia Tech School of Neuroscience and the Virginia Tech Carillon School of Medicine. Gary majored in biochem at Dartmouth College, then received his med degree from UMDNJ, Rutgers Medical School. He trained in neurosurgery at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, completed a fellowship in medical research at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and also holds a master's degree in healthcare delivery science from Dartmouth Institute and the Dartmouth Tuck School of Business, and is a fellow of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons. I think what's quite impressive, in addition to those accomplishments, is to know that Gary's performed over 13,000 major neurological procedures and types and complexities and has treated tens of thousands of patients. He continues to teach undergraduates at Virginia Tech and medical students at VTCSOM, produces educational material for international medical educational company MedMastery, and writes a blog for Psychology Today online. His professional passions have included clinical neuroscience, medical education, humanism, science, writing, ethics, medical socioeconomics, and personal wellness. He routinely presents and teaches at various national and international courses and meetings. We have one point of intersection, which is we both have published in Psychology Today. And Psychology Today online. So there's a common point of intersection. But for the last 14 years, past 14 years, Gary has studied and lectured widely on burnout and resilience. He's written 3 related books: Building Resilience in Neurological Residence, The Thriving Physician, and Thriving in Healthcare. He has recently released his first novel, a medical psychological thriller entitled Death's Pale Flag. He's currently working on a coming-of-age soccer novel, One Happy Accident. You can learn more about Gary and connect with Gary at his website, GaryRSimonds.com, and all of that will be in the show notes. And on a personal note, if you could, Gary and I, he now lives in a log cabin in Black Mountain, North Carolina, with his wife of 43 years, Cindy, and faithful border collie, Hamish. He loves
Hamish.
playing the Hamish. Thank you.
Hamish.
That's great, Hamish. He loves playing the banjo and guitar and learning how to play the bagpipes, much to his neighbor's chagrin. But Gary, welcome. Why don't you condense that for us and tell us about yourself?
It needs a little condensing, I think. I think I'll just call it all around nice guy. That's what I want to be known as. But thank you so very much having me, and it really is a great honor and opportunity. I'm sorry we took so much time with an overinflated CV there, but hopefully we can get down to some brass tacks for you.
Well, it didn't list all your publications. That would have taken us another 23 pages probably. So I think we're good. No, but I thought about the condensed version: neurosurgeon, writer, educator, and speaker. But I think all of the background detail and why I wanted our audience to know is that it certainly informs what you're currently working on. I mean, your recently released book, and I wanted our audience to know how that experience maybe shaped what drew you to writing that novel.
Yeah, I'm sure there are many threads, but I guess there are a couple of major threads or rivers leading into the novel. One is that the world of neurosurgery is, I think, probably a strange and mysterious place to most people, and can be pretty terrifying place as well. But I really wanted to be able to represent it and let people have a good peek inside, a good peek behind the curtains, and get a good idea of what exactly does go on in that world. Frankly, I really wanted to demonstrate the bravery and the grace of so many of our patients and their families. So I've had that desire for many years to get it down in writing. And I eventually decided that it would be maybe more immersive, more impactful if it was woven into a fiction, into a story, rather than just reporting, well, here's what the modern neurosurgical world looks like. And I think the other stream that came in was, as you said, for the last more than decade and a half, really, I got deeply immersed into the world of burnout mostly in healthcare professionals, and trying to ameliorate it, trying to prevent it, i.e. through building resilience and wellness. And obviously that became even more sharply focused during the years of the pandemic and now afterwards. But so I think those two streams really came together, and the book therefore deals with a neurosurgeon of all things who is clearly burned out and is beginning to have trouble with reality.
What does a neurosurgeon do?
A neurosurgeon, I guess, technically we're around to treat diseases of the nervous system anywhere from the brain through the spinal cord out into the nerves, all the way out into your fingers if you must, and treat diseases that can be treated kind of physically, if you will, meaning through surgery, through physical manipulation. If there's a tumor, I'll take the tumor out. If there's an aneurysm, I'll clip it off from the circulation. If there's hemorrhage, I'll take that out. As opposed to, say, a neurologist who treats diseases of the nervous system as well, but they tend to be the diseases that are on the microscopic level, mitochondrial problems, DNA problems, whatever. So things like multiple sclerosis would come under the purview of neurologists. I can't fix individual neurons, so that's with a knife, so that wouldn't really fall under my purview, although the two disciplines very much intersect.
Makes sense. And why the topics of burnout and wellness?
Well, I mean, it all started, and I always like to say they. So you gotta replace. If I throw in a few theys, you have to replace it with we's. But I ran a neurosurgery program. I had 10 or 11 neurosurgeons, 10 or 11 physician assistants, 7 residents, a whole bunch of nurses and nursing staff. And we were running into a real problem of complaints not about the care. I think the care was always exquisite, but about the behaviors of my team, including myself. And these complaints were coming in fast and furious. I mean, I could get 20, 30, 40 in a month, and I had to deal with them. And after a while, I had reached a point of frustration trying to figure out why we were all being such jerks. I mean, we were perceived as yeah, the neurosurgeons are there if you need them, but otherwise you just want to stay away because they'll bite your head off. And I was confronted with the problem. Do I have to change my team? Do I have to start firing people? Or is there something else behind it? And I started getting interested in the concept of burnout. And could this be burnout? And then just by happenstance, I met a world authority on physician burnout. His name's Wayne Sotil. He's a clinical psychologist who has studied and treated thousands of physicians. And we started working together on a long-term project with my team on trying to build resilience and wellness to combat burnout. And the net effect was, I mean, so stunning that it turned me into a zealot. I felt like I had to proselytize because it took quite a few months at first because there was a lot of cynicism and why are you wasting my time? But after a while, I mean, the complaints dropped to zero. I mean, literally zero. And then all these thank yous were coming in and all these congratulatory notes were coming in. And soon team members were winning, awards across the hospital for how wonderful they were. And the scales fell from my eyes. And I said, this is a real thing, a real deal. And there are plenty of reasons in medicine for this to happen to anybody, to all healthcare workers. So that's how we got deeply involved in it. And not that all other industries aren't plagued by it as well, because we just live in a world where, everything's going a mile a minute, you're multitasked, you never have a chance to stop and think. And so I think, all industries are subject to it. But of course, I know my industry the best.
Resilience is certainly informed and developed through experience. Perhaps you stood up to a bully in elementary school. You learned to work with a caustic boss, a micromanager. Is there a resilience gene as well?
Well, to answer simply, yes and no. Maybe to have the coward's way out. There's no specific gene, right? But we're all put together differently. And I often have this conversation. So bear with me if I riff on it. But I think it's an important thing to understand is that we tend to see ourselves as human beings as almost being like computers, where in the computer factory you connect all these wires up. There's semiconductors or whatever the heck they are, but you connect wire to wire to wire to wire, and there's thousands of these connections. And then, you put the casing on it and you ship it out and it comes to your house, you open the box and there you have your computer. And that's how it's put together. And we tend to think of ourselves, I think, in similar ways. We get put together in the factory and we come out and that's what we have. And therefore, if I have genes that make me more prone to this or that, well, that's just the way it is. The reality is the brain is forever changing. All those little wires that we might have in a computer, of which in our own brains, we have quadrillions of wires and connections going on. But those connections are changing all the time, depending on our experiences, depending on what we see, do, feel, touch, everything that we encounter in our day-to-day lives is changing our brain. And therefore, yes, some of the wiring is set up by our genes, but a lot of it's our experience. A lot of it is what we're going through. We certainly strengthen various areas of our brain and downgrade various areas of our brain depending on our experiences.
I've had the opportunity to work with many rheumatologists, many gastroenterologists, and other physician scholars. And one of the things that I'm always interested in is what attracted them to their particular discipline. I always laugh when the gastroenterologists, many of them tell me that they, love playing video games when they were kids. They're used to scoping. It's all fine. What led you to neurosurgery? What was the path there?
I frequently tell this story too to pre-meds and medical students, because I try to use it as a warning. And that is, I like all medical students, I went through several iterations of what I was going to be. So I started out as a family doc, and then I was going to be an oncologist, a cancer doc, and then I was going to be a general surgeon, and then I was going to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. And I had settled on cardiothoracic surgery, had my residency all set up. And my last rotation in medical school, I saw a brain operation for the first time, and I was just like, oh my God, I have got to do that. And, it was pure, almost you might call it epiphany or something, but it was instantly, that is what I have to do. And the reason why I use it as a warning sign is I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I got myself into a lot. It's a big dive, but I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And I lucked out, because now I can't imagine doing anything else. But I always tell them, I do believe you should follow your heart, follow your epiphanies, if you will, but do some research first, what you're getting yourself into.
I think, as you stated earlier, you also know a lot about neuroscience. I mean, the clinical applications of neuroscience. I mean, it would seem that it would inform your field, that, both sides would have some. I am currently in a coaching certification program led by Shirzad Shamin, who did his PhD studies in neuroscience and MS in electrical engineering, MBA from Stanford. And I've always been hesitant or reluctant around all of this leadership and neuroscience stuff. In Shirzad's training program, this coaching program, it does talk about interrupting neural pathways by following a set of techniques, which I think probably makes sense. That if you're in your judge mode or in your critic mode, that you need a way to be able to access a more rational self, a happier self, a more fulfilled self. So what he talks about is making these interruptions. Maybe it's by rubbing the tips of your fingertips. Maybe it's by rubbing your toes together, things that you might be able to do in meetings, so that you stop, for a moment, you have something that triggers your access to a more rational self. Any belief in any of this? Have you read about this leadership and neuroscience, and what do you think? And if not, we'll just move on to another topic.
No, I think so much in neuroscience is, I guess I would say, informed supposition. We know a lot about how things work, but we know very little, if that makes any sense. In other words, we've discovered so much, and we have these fMRIs, and we can look inside and look what parts of the brain light up, and how what gets activated by various activities or thought patterns and stuff like that. But it's still like looking from 50,000 feet, because what's happening is way down on the microscopic level, where a lot of these changes take place. So we're kind of scratching on at the surface. So things like that potentially make a lot of sense. Anytime you can alter what you're reinforcing within the brain, you are potentially changing the brain. How we're changing it on that microscopic level, we do not know. I'm not sure we'll ever figure out. But we get some ideas when we look at it from a more gross perspective. And there's certainly some support of that. And we know, for example, too, if you're subjected to constant stress, that whole regions of the brain begin to shut down. They literally shrink. Other areas that are there for when you are stressed, fight or flight, and being more protective or even aggressive may be reinforced, and they begin to increase in their activity and even increase in their density. So we do know that various actions actually affect the brain on multiple levels, all the way down to the microchemistry, all the way down to the genes and how the genes are expressed. So yeah, I put a lot into it. Whether we can, give definitive, absolute proof that we know exactly what's going on in the brain, no, we don't. So, for example, in the books, that we've written on building resilience, it's all very pragmatic and very practical. We don't try to get in the weeds of super dense neuroscience or super dense psychology, and we just try to go with what seems to work. So it's a very pragmatic approach, and we try to keep it as simple as possible because we think that if we make it, super complex or multiple steps, nobody's going to want to do it. And so simple exercises, simple changes in patterns of behavior, I think are potentially very effective. There in that world, there is no epiphanies. You can't give a lecture and have everybody sit there and go, oh, okay, now I get it. I'll never burn out. You need multiple little methods to take care of it that you have to do repetitively. So yeah, sure.
Gary, one of the issues, Gary R. Simonds, one of the issues that I'd like to explore with you is around power and authority. Let me come to the reference here. You mentioned flight, fight, and I've studied bion psychology for quite some time. Participated in the Tavistock Institute for the study of social relations based on Bion's theories of flight and fight. As you think about power and authority, because that's essentially what many of the social applications are, bionistic psychology, are on that. You have to deliver bad news to people, break bad news to people. You have to, in developing surgeons, you have to apply a lot of critical thinking. How's all that come together for you in terms of how you confronted your own power and authority in these kinds of very difficult situations, I have to imagine, where people are just frightened beyond belief?
Yeah, people are frightened beyond belief. And as you're noting, we give horrible news. We give horrible news every day, often many times in a day. I always say, if you live anywhere near, a major medical center and you hear that helicopter going overhead, every time that helicopter is going overhead, or every time you hear an ambulance siren, somebody's world is being turned upside down and really pretty much decimated. And I think, one of the ways that we tried to work with our residents, for example, is this is not a world to just wade into and wing it. I think we have, in other words, you're not going to do it by the force, I hope. I hope you're going to go at it in a very thoughtful manner. And, we worked a lot with the residents on how do you talk to people about everything from counseling them from surgery to telling them that they've lost a loved one or that a loved one is paralyzed or that sort of thing, or even talking to lawyers, which we unfortunately may have to do periodically. One thing I think very much is it's important to actually rehearse and practice and look for best practices get critique from your colleagues, and really work on your skills of communication. I think communication skills are obviously absolutely critical here. I think another component of it is educational skills, because I would argue that every patient interaction, every family interaction is actually an educational exercise, because you've got to bring them up to date. You have to bring them up to snuff on what the heck's going on. And it can be hyper complex, and you're going to have to adjust it to their level of medical sophistication. So there's a lot of communication skills that have to be built. And yes, a lot of it is done on the fly, but I think the more intentional we are about it, I think the better we become, at least quicker. As far as how do you deal with it on the emotional level, I think everybody's got to discover that for themselves. And one of the central tenets of building resilience that we believe in is knowing yourself, having emotional intelligence about yourself. Who are you? What moves you? What inspires passion? What scares you? What brings you down? All that sort of thing. But I think for me, for example, I was just forever stunned by what I call the grace of the patients and their families and their sheer bravery. And so that actually made it considerably easier, because even though it was dire and you were telling awful things, you would also get these waves of, I don't know, humanity that would go through you, and it was inspiring. So I think that, that made it easier. It made you want to do the very best you could. When we were doing these resilience sessions with our team, other ideas came up as well. And one, for example, that I think really stuck with the team is that even in these horrible situations, there's a lot of situations in neurosurgery where you're not doing any good. You're fighting a losing battle. And so you can feel pretty hopeless at times, and you can feel pretty beat up at times as you're throwing yourself against these immovable forces. But what people began to observe when you're getting into these conversations with patients and their families is, even though we're not doing something specifically for the neurological problem, we still have that opportunity to affect human suffering. The better job we do at working with the family, working with the patient, the more suffering we're potentially easing. And that's hopefully one of the central core points of being a physician, is trying to help with human suffering.
So one of my mentors said about coaching, Bob Keegan at Harvard Graduate School of Education. I took Bob's Immunity to Change program, certified in that. Bob always said the purpose of coaching was to eliminate a little bit of suffering.
Yeah, I mean,
I always think it's a little something different. I think it's to get people to happiness. Maybe it's just two sides, the different sides of the same coin. But Gary, I want to talk about one more topic just before we wrap up. And for all of our HR leaders who are in the audience today, or for our folks in biotech or biopharma, Gary has so many great topics, as you can see, to discuss. He can go from writing fiction to burnout and wellness, to medical ethics, compassionate care, facing personal illness, death and dying, gratitude and humor in life, facing mayhem and tragedy. Topics we haven't even touched around spirituality, living for today, living sustainably. Gary, let's wrap up with the topic about why kindness matters.
We can go into the neuropsychology of it. There's a fair amount of evidence that acts of kindness. When I was looking for a word for it, and it's not coming to me, but just spontaneous acts of kindness, just helping each other out without any absolute benefit to you, actually does benefit you. It is, one of the more stronger drivers of having a sense of meaning, having a sense of purpose, both of which are also very strong drivers in building resilience. There's even, some neuroscience evidence that repeated acts of kindness will strengthen the reward centers of your brain and bring you more joy and happiness, which all sounds very selfish. So I'm
right.
saying,
And as a social psychologist, it's a field with a lot of raggedy edges. But I think there's a lot of agreement in this area that acts of kindness towards others begets positive aspects to the individual.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not saying that you should do acts of kindness to simply benefit yourself. But it's interesting there too. We have a corollary, and I think it works, and that is like in our field, we're almost. Part of our job is to notice bad things and to anticipate bad things. That's part of my job, is never to rest on your laurels. A surgery goes well. We're not sitting there patting ourselves on the back and high-fiving. We're going, all right, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? This could go wrong, that could go wrong. We'd always be quizzing the residents, what's going to go wrong next? You better anticipate, you better be on top of it. But what that does is it really puts your mind into a very negative frame of reference, because you're just looking at the world as what could go wrong, because everything can go wrong. And in fact, we when we surveyed our teams and stuff, we could see that was getting transposed out into their worlds outside of the hospital, which is kind of scary. But so one of the main lessons that we would give is we want you to start training yourself to what we call harvest uplifts, to seek out good stuff, because good stuff is going on around us all the time. You just don't notice it because you're looking for the bad stuff, but patients are thanking you, families are smiling at you, patients actually do get better sometimes, and that sort of thing. And we would tell people, write down 5 a day for a while, for 2 weeks, write down 5 things that went well today. Or, even just a nice song on the radio that brought you, positive waves. Well, what happens is if you do that, if you force yourself to do it, what happens after a while is your brain will just start seeking the stuff out itself. You don't have to tell it after a while. It'll start noticing it. And so you build upon that. And I would say the same thing goes for things like acts of kindness. Is, at first you may have to be very purposeful about it. And in the hospital, you may notice that a patient just looks uncomfortable in bed. Go help them, move the pillows around, or sit down and just talk to a patient for a while, who seems lonely or scared or sad. And you may have to force yourself to do it the first few weeks. But after a while, that then just becomes natural. You have grooved those pathways in your brain. And, as I said, you end up benefiting from it yourself, but obviously you're spreading it around. You're setting off ripples in a pond. I don't know. How do you approach the same?
Well, it's very similar. Working with executives and leaders of organizations who are often, very busy and overwhelmed by their tasks and the organizations and teams that they lead and manage. Waiting for employee feedback, as you alluded to earlier in our discussion around behavior patterns present on your team, a lot of people, they wait for these employee engagement survey results in companies, and I'm always like, why don't you just get out of your chair and ask some people? It's the same, it's just a way of getting some data a lot more quicker. So I appreciate that, particularly in the acts of because I think these interactions also inform our humanness and make us approachable, coming back to the issues of power and authority that we just also discussed.
Absolutely. Mike, just as another quick example, when I was in the Army at Walter Reed, for a while there, we had a commanding general who was like right out of the movies of like Patton or something, where everything was super formal, and he would periodically make his rounds through the hospital, but you would be notified, weeks in advance. Everybody was supposed to be spit and polished and, kind of standing there at attention. And he would come through with this big group of, sycophants and, everything was, how's it going? Perfectly fine, sir. Everything couldn't be better. And that was the expectation. And we got another commanding general who came in, and you would be there in the middle of the night, in an ICU, writing a note, sweaty, just exhausted. And this guy would appear out of nowhere, nobody around him. He'd kind of put a hand on your shoulder and say, hey, how's it going? What can I do to make your job easier? And he meant it. And, just that difference in leadership. And that was an act of kindness,
absolutely.
That to me, was a great example.
Well, it's been great to have Gary R. Simonds as a guest on Authentic Change with Mike Horne, neurosurgeon, writer, educator, and speaker. Great speaker for many of you in HR or leaders in scientific organizations or biopharma or biotech. Gary has a wealth of topics and just a wealth of wisdom, and has a great book out in 2023, which has been so well reviewed, Death's Pale Flag, a fictionalized story, I think, of his life, but hopefully bringing together the topics of neuroscience, healthcare, medical ethics, burnout, resilience, and wellness. And those are all good topics to be in touch with Gary. And please look in the show notes for ways to be in touch with him. But a good place to start would be GaryRSimons.com. Once again, Gary, thank you so much. It's been a delight having you as a guest.
Oh my gosh, it's an absolute pleasure. I wish we could do it much longer.
And until the next episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horne, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horne.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horne.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.